Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's program brought to you by the U.S. Botanic Garden. My name is Carnivorous, the online education specialist with the Learning and Outreach team here at the Garden. We are so happy to have you joining us for Creepy Roots, Underground Plant Behavior, an online lecture with USBG gardener Kathryn Parker. In conjunction with our newest exhibit, Fierce Flora, Tales of Survival and Demise, we are excited to journey with Kathryn as she explores the underground world of plants. I know we're used to the beautiful blooms of spring and leaf peeping of autumn, but now let's consider what lies beneath in the fall and winter months. Let me introduce our presenter today. Kathryn Parker is a gardener with the U.S. Botanic Gardens Horticulture Exhibits and Displays team. She has experience caring for historic landscapes, teaching botanic science classes to children, visiting the garden on school trips, and caring for tropical and perennial plants, previously helping run a nursery greenhouse department. Additionally, she spent many years educating about native plants and seed saving techniques, specializing in plants suited to growing in Mediterranean and desert climates. Please welcome Kathryn.
Hi, everybody.
Hey, Kathryn.
Pleasure to be here today.
It is so cool that we get to do this together. I love
great.
it. So, as a gardener, what got you to the USBG? What got you here?
Well, as you mentioned, I've really been interested in plants for a very long time, and it's sort of just been a natural force that drew me over the course of my life. I think, as with a lot of people who get into plant work, that path was not exactly straight, but eventually plants just they call you. And so I started out noticing them, taking pictures of them, getting to know the plants in my area, eventually learned enough that I could teach others about the really cool plants that are in my area. And then decided at some point to shift into making the plants versus teaching my primary career. So I studied a lot of different plants in a nursery setting, in greenhouse, and then ended up here at AOC and then eventually here at the Botanic Garden, where I get to work with a lot of different types of plants. We do the seasonal displays that rotate throughout the year here at the garden. So I love it because it gives me a chance to work with a lot of different plants throughout the year and to really experiment with accessing and displaying different sides of them that you might not think about in your normal, just looking at something and saying, oh, that's beautiful. We can highlight scent, or we can highlight, plants from a certain area of the world or that have certain characteristics. So it's a great opportunity for me. I absolutely love getting to share what I learn here out with you guys as well.
Yeah, that sounds incredible. What are some of the exciting things that you're working on right now at the garden?
So you mentioned the Fierce Flora exhibit. That's something that we very recently installed here at the garden. It's running for 2 years. It's a really cool exhibit. I definitely recommend, if you guys are local, to come and check it out. We're highlighting the structures of plants that are used defensively, or ways that plants protect themselves in the environment.
Is that the background that you have going on there? Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I was just so enthralled by this beautiful background. It looks like Fierce Flora.
Plants have a lot of really interesting ways to defend themselves. This is just this is a background that you might find throughout the exhibit. It does showcase a lot of the different plants that we talk about. And so that we just finished installing it recently. It's a nice, fresh, new exhibit. It's great to check that out. And then also upcoming, as we roll into the holiday season, we are currently installing our holiday show, which is both throughout the garden in the conservatory. We have a beautiful set of buildings that we highlight using natural materials, and a bunch of plants that sort of brighten up the place and bring that holiday spirit into the conservatory. And then outside in the gardens and grounds and some of our gated gardens, we have a train show that is very
The
popular.
train
People
is
love it.
coming back. The train is coming back. How cool is that?
Yes, very excited for that. So currently at the moment we're pushing all those plants up there to try to create a miniature world that you can just go out there and enjoy and just immerse yourself in the train display and enjoy a little bit of holiday cheer.
Oh, that is so fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you for the work that you're doing around the garden. And even thank you for like the research that you've done for this particular program. I know we all tend to get really excited about what goes on above ground, but now we'll get to take a deep dive of what goes on underground. So we're really looking forward to your presentation today. And please, you got it.
All right, thanks, Courtney. All right. So as Courtney mentioned, we tend to think about the tops of plants quite a bit. It's what we see every single day. It's kind of what we interact with most in the plant world. But the truth is that there are really no plants that exist solely above the ground without any interaction with the soil below. So I'd love to start today with just like a sort of general discussion of like roots. What are they? What purpose are they serving for the plant? If every plant has them, then they're clearly serving some pretty important structural and life-giving purposes. So a root is basically, for the most part, the part of the plant that grows underground. The plant world loves exceptions, so there are some exceptions to that. You might find aerial roots on certain tropical plants, or maybe if you've ever been to a mangrove forest, you might see some roots that kind of like creep out above the surface of the water. But for the most part, roots are generally running underground. They serve several different important purposes. You can see here, the main ones would be that they provide an anchor. They protect the plant from getting moved around in the environment. They anchor not only the actual structure of the plant itself, but they also help to anchor the soil that's around the plant and to create like a stable environment where the plant can exist. You can find a couple of different main root structures, and they serve different purposes in this sense. One, you find a lot of plants that have what we call a taproot system. And that's like, if you've ever pulled out a garden weed that's just really, really hard to get rid of, a lot of those have taproot systems. So they have one long central root that's going down in the middle. They can travel really great distances if they need to find water. They also serve kind of like as like a tent peg. They're anchoring that plant to the ground really well. On those types of systems, that taproot will have a lot of little lateral roots that will move outward from that main root. And those tend to help sort of to anchor it outwards as well. If you just have like one central stalk and it can be prone to sort of bending, or if the soil is a little bit loose, it might fall over. But those lateral roots, they help to anchor it further, giving a lot more points of contact around the soil. They also tend to be up at the top of the root system, so like close to the surface of the soil. And they're collecting most of the water that is falling in the environment, because the water will only go so deep into a soil profile. So they're collecting a lot of the water that the root is getting. There's also a different kind of root system that's called fibrous root system. And so those are, like if you think about grasses and you pull out a grass and it kind of just has like a little tuft of roots at the bottom. There's no one central structure. It's kind of all even. Or if you've ever pulled an onion out of the ground, you see that it has sort of like a bunch of little rootlets coming out, and they're all about the same size. They're sort of spreading out evenly. That's a fibrous root. So they are particularly good at anchoring not just the plant itself, but the soil around it. So they're really good for helping build soil that doesn't erode away, and to create like a really lush trap of nutrients up at the top of the soil. Some of the the plants that you might see and associate with that might be like bananas, or like I mentioned, grasses or ferns. It's kind of just like a little tuft of roots at the bottom. There are, of course, plants that like to use both kind of roots. For example, like an oak tree, you find one very long, deep taproot, but then it also has a bunch of little roots spreading out along the surface. So you can find combinations. A lot of our like civilization type building grains, those will also be something that will be a fibrous root system. So that's kind of what structure roots will take. As far as is it like on the plant itself? So most of the time, like I said, they're growing underground, but you could just as easily have a stem that grows underground. A lot of plants, you may have heard the term rhizomes, and that's basically a little bit of stem that is growing under the ground and kind of like traveling a little bit and then making a new plant at the end. But that is actually stem. So how do we tell the difference? The thing about roots is they grow from a tip, and they just basically push down into the soil. They have what's essentially like a hard hat on. It's called the root cap. And that gives the root a little bit of extra structure and allows it to defend itself, because the area that's growing the root is actually right behind that little root cap there. And it's responsible for adding all new cells. So roots only grow from the end in terms of adding new cells. But as I'm sure you've noticed, like if you think about a carrot, right? As it gets older, it gets much bigger. So it doesn't necessarily stay small. But what's happening is that the cells that are already there, they're elongating. And then once they've gotten down to a depth where they want to be, then they're starting to swell up and to grow in diameter. So that's called like primary growth, is when it's digging down into the ground and it's charting new territory. And then as the root gets more established, the root can start to grow in diameter and actually store some stuff. If you look at our screen here, I mentioned stabilization and anchoring. Probably the other thing that people most associate with roots would be water uptake, right? We're all taught like the water goes in the roots, it goes up into the plant. That is definitely the case. The majority of water uptake is through root systems. They do that through differing pressure in the soil. And it carries up into the root structure, not just the water, but if you look at the next one, the nutrients that the plant is getting as well. So minerals are pulled into the structure of the roots and become available for the plant to use. There are some interesting relationships happening down there. So the plant is able to use certain types of materials that are in the soil, but there's certain materials that it needs, namely nitrogen, that is very abundantly available in the environment, but it's not in a form that the plants can use. So sometimes they'll form like little partnerships. So there are classes of plants that we call nitrogen fixers, and they have actually created a symbiotic relationship with bacteria in the soil. And those bacteria, they basically create a little home inside the roots in nodes. So the nodes form, and they live inside of these nodes, and they're able to take the nitrogen that's in the environment and convert it into a form that the plants can use. So if you're planting a garden and you're feeling like your soil is maybe getting a little bit worn out, plants aren't growing as well as you would hope, it could be interesting or like useful to plant what we call the nitrogen fixers. Those tend to be things in the legume family or some of the cereal grain families. And those can actually help to like restore the nutrient availability of the soil and make them more accessible to plants. So that's one relationship that plants have struck, but they have actually also struck another relationship that's very important, and that is with the kingdom of fungi. So a lot of plants form what we call mycorrhizal relationships, and mycorrhizal relationships are sort of an interface where mycorrhizae are the underground network filaments of what we recognize as mushrooms. When mushrooms come up, they're sort of the fruiting body of these organisms. And under the ground, the vast majority of that organism is living. And they perform a really interesting service for plants. They've developed together, and a lot of plants have particular types of fungi that they like to work with. They actually can channel different nutrients and water from around the soil basin, because if you think about a plant, it's kind of stuck where it's at, right? So if there's not a lot of available nutrients, or there's not like the best supply of what it needs right where it's at, it could either just get stuck with that, or it could strike up one of these relationships. The mycorrhizal network will shuttle the nutrients that the plant says it needs into the plant, and in exchange, the plant, which is photosynthesizing and creating carbohydrates or sugars, then exchanges that for sugars with the mycorrhizal network. So that's another thing that's kind of happening beneath the soil that people don't necessarily see too often, because these networks are they're usually invisible to us. If you dig down in some really rich soil, you might notice that there's these white filament looking things in that soil. That's actually, those are those mycorrhizae that are spreading out through the soil and helping to shuttle nutrients, not only from the actual environment itself, the soil profile into the plant, but they can actually connect between plants and shuttle, nutrients that one plant might have an excess of. They might shuttle out through that mycorrhizal network, and in exchange, another plant in the environment that needs it is going to get the nutrients that they need. So those partnerships are really cool. If you look at the next stage, it says nutrient storage. If you've ever pulled up a root vegetable, that's probably a really obvious example of the nutrient storage that happens in a plant. So they can use it kind of like as a warehouse of different vitamins. They use it as water storage. If you think about a plant, like it can't just be like, I'm thirsty and go get a drink of water from the fridge. Sometimes the environmental conditions are a little bit spottier than that. We might go a month without rain, then we might have a lot of rain. So these nutrient storage and water storage capabilities in the roots allow the plant to sort of meter out what it's going to need up top by having a warehouse down bottom. Like I said, some of the things that you would associate it with your root vegetables, also like tuberous type vegetables. So like potatoes, sweet potatoes, they're holding a lot of stuff under the ground. Those deep tap roots that I talked about earlier, they're also storing nutrients and water within them. And we will get back to those a little bit later. They might be showing up in our cast of characters. So they can also be responsible for reproduction. There's certain classes of plants that, for example, some of your weeds that you're trying to pull out of the yard, and it seems like if you just leave that little bit of root in the soil, they can grow up and they can grow an entirely new plant. That's probably like the least friendly way that we interact with them. But also, if you think about like ginger, if you've ever bought like a ginger root from the grocery store, you can take a little piece of that ginger which is the root of the plant, and you can plant it underground, and that little piece will grow an entirely new plant. So that happens out in nature as well. Another plant that we sort of commonly run into if you're in the gardening world would be like dahlias. Anything where you can sort of pull off a chunk of root. Potatoes, if it has an eye of the potato, you can separate it and plant it back in the ground. It'll grow an entirely new plant. There's a special class of roots, just before we step into the main part of our conversation here, that are called adventitious roots. And those are roots that a plant can put out from basically any point on the plant that's not, down at the bottom under the soil. So if you have leaves, or if you've seen some of those greenhouse plants where they have little air roots growing out the sides of what we call nodes, those are adventitious roots. And a lot of those you can separate from the host plant, and they can actually sustain life and become an entirely different plant by themselves. So as I said, plant world loves exceptions, but that's just another way that plant can reproduce. And they have these multiple strategies because a lot of times, like I said, they are locked in where they're at. The idea of reproduction of the species is that they would like to be able to spread far and wide. So if a piece breaks off of a plant and maybe gets carried by an animal, a certain distance away, if it has the ability to take that little piece of top of plant, throw down some roots, and then reproduce, that's helpful to the plant. So what I'd like to do is tell you a few cool root stories that are slightly unusual in the root world. There are, of course, tons of interesting plants out there, but I just want to highlight a few that we have some contact with here in the garden, or maybe you have run into in your travels through the plant world. The first root story I'd like to talk about is carnivorous roots. If you think about, you can see here, this is Utricularia. It's also called the bladderwort. This is an example that we have here at the garden. This one in particular is Utricularia longifolia. So if you think about the conditions that most carnivorous plants grow in, they have adapted the ability to digest animal materials because they live in particularly low nutrient environments, low oxygen environments if it's under the surface of the water. So in order to get those necessary nutrients that it needs for life, they've evolved all sorts of creative ways to try to ingest those nutrients from sources that most plants really don't have the need to get them from because they're getting it from their soil profile. So Utricularia longifolia is an aquatic plant. You can see here in the picture that it is sitting in a tray of water. And underneath the surface, if you look here, on the root hairs, there are all these little, we call them bladders. So these are the traps. So if you think of a carnivorous plant like a Venus flytrap, it's closing around, a fly or some sort of insect up on the top. But in this particular case, these plants, all the action is happening under the ground. There are about 220 species of bladderwort that live around the world. They actually live in all sorts of different environments, but the one thing that probably ties them all together is that they tend to be waterlogged soils. So these roots are under there in the subsurface, and their chance at prey is really something swimming by or something soaking through a very waterlogged soil, so it's swinging by. So these guys have bladders, and I'm going to advance here a little bit. You can see both the bladders. They are visible to the human eye. You can see on the right side of the screen, that's a close-up of a bladder that we put under the microscope. You can see it has little hairs up at the top of the pouch, and some of them are a little bit longer than others. And what's happening here is this is very small. It's only 2 cell walls thick. That's why you can kind of see through. There's a dark spot in the middle of the bladder. So it's basically a big pouch that has been sealed at the top with mucilage, which is kind of like a plant glue. We're going to talk a lot more about that in a little bit. So it seals it closed and creates a low pressure environment. So what will happen is when those hairs are triggered, so the guide hair sort of like helps to guide potential prey into the general area, the zone of like entrapment. And then when those little hairs are triggered, it causes the mucilage on the bladder to just dissolve really quickly, and the pouch opens. But because the pouch has no water in it, it's created this like low pressure environment. What happens is, like if you put a cup underneath the surface of water, like water rushes into that cup because there's no water in there, right? So water rushes into these bladders. Any prey that happens to be swimming in this water as well also rushes into the bladder, and then it snaps shut. This happens really fast, tenths of a second. We have, if you do get a chance to come and visit our Fierce Flora exhibit, a really cool video of that actually in process of it eating some of the prey. So everything gets trapped inside this bladder, and then the plant starts to just eject the water again. And in its place inside of the pouch, it's secreting digestive juices. and they're incredibly effective. They're very fast. So a complete turnaround on one of these bladders, it can be used 20 or 30 times, but the time between when it opens and captures something that it can digest to when it closes, it starts to digest everything, it uptakes all those nutrients, and then it basically is reset and ready for business again, might even just be a few hours. So those digestive juices are incredibly potent. Probably one of the worst fates for a tiny, aquatic organism is if it's slightly too large for the trap. It might only get pulled partially into that trap, and then the doors close. It's kind of stuck in there, but only halfway. But meanwhile, everything that is in there is getting digested, and as it struggles around a little bit, it's triggering those hairs again, and the plant is essentially just like continuing to suck it in slowly, bit by bit. So it is Halloween. We're kind of talking creepy things happening here. That's something that I feel like, as a waterborne organism, it would ruin your day. And then they get digested, and then the plant returns to its ready state again. So that's something that happens under the surface of water. But there are some other roots. If you look here, mucilaginous roots, and you heard me mention mucilage in the last segment a little bit. These are also affected by water, but in a slightly different way. So mucilage is essentially a bunch of simple sugars that are kind of put together to make a bit of a slime. There are a lot of plants that we'll talk about in a second where you might recognize this. But if you think about, like, if you've ever put okra into a stew or into something in it and it gets a little bit slimy around the edges of it, or if you've ever taken Metamucil, it's a thickener. It's basically something that, or agar, it's like something that helps to thicken stuff up. These sugars are really good at holding water. And so a lot of plants, really most plants, contain a certain amount of mucilage, but some contain much more than others. And the one that we're going to talk about today, we'll talk about a couple, but this one here is called Abelmoschus manahot. It's sometimes called the sunset muskmallow, or abica. We'll talk a little bit about that, where it's used, but it's like okra. It's very closely related to okra. You can kind of see from this picture here in our garden, there are little pods forming. Those are the seed pods. They do look a little bit similar to an okra pod. Probably they aren't really eaten for their pods just because they have stiff hairs all around them, but essentially they do kind of look like an okra when you open them up. But this is an incredibly nutritious plant, and it's eaten around the world. It's very high in vitamin C and A. It has a ton of protein and a lot of iron in it. So people will prepare the leaves as a leafy vegetable, or they'll use the properties that we're just talking about in order to thicken up soups and stews. So it's a great plant to have in the garden if you can grow it. It is native to Southeast Asia, but it grows as an annual in most places of the world. So it's something that you could put in. As you can see, it has beautiful showy flowers. Those are also edible. So if you're an edible flower enthusiast, you could put petals of this into a dish or in a salad if you wanted to. It's a beautiful plant. It blooms all season. It doesn't mind drought conditions. One of the reasons that it doesn't mind drought conditions is because it has an incredibly high concentration of this mucilage in its roots. So in order to sort of visualize what mucilage is, it might be helpful to mention some of the plants that have very high concentrations. If you've ever opened up an aloe plant and you get that sort of the slime that's happening on the inside of the aloe plant, or if you have seen the inside of a cactus. So a cactus has a really dry, tough exterior, but the inside of the plant is very moist, and it holds a lot of water because it needs to be able to go long periods of drought between water in its environment. If you've ever done a chia pet, or you've taken chia seeds and put them into a drink, it sort of swells up a little bit and it gets very slimy. Those are another really good example of mucilage. You can also look at it so like I mentioned, like Metamucil, it's like something that it swells out. Flax seeds and psyllium, they have a lot of this, and that's what's actually acting inside of the body. It helps to like pull water out of your system and hold things together, and then also pull toxins out of your intestinal system. So mucilage is used in a lot of different applications. It tends to be, because it's just a collection of sugars, it's edible, or it's not poisonous. So one application that you might run into that you wouldn't think about necessarily being associated with plants is if you lick a postage stamp, or if you have an envelope and you're licking the envelope. Those glues that are on those are made from mucilage, because when mucilage is dry, it's sort of hard and crispy. And then in the presence of water, it just expands exponentially and becomes slimy. So if you look here, you can see the root of Abelmoschus manihope. On the right side, I have taken some roots and immersed them in water and then crushed them a little bit. And you can see there's just an incredible amount of slime coming out of there. It's very sort of snot-like, and it's consistently, it's very sticky. As you can see, it has a little bit of structure to it. And in environments where either a plant is going to be dry for extreme periods of time, or alternately in environments where the soil is very compacted, plants might produce this mucilage to help sort of lubricate them as they push down into the soil and form their roots. So this plant in particular has a really interesting use in washi paper making. It's used in a lot of different crafts, but washi paper making is an ancient art of making beautiful fine papers. The same plant is used in different versions of fine paper making in a lot of like Asian cultures. But today we'll be talking about washi paper making. That washi literally translates to Japanese paper. So washi papers are known for being incredibly high quality, tough papers that can still, a lot of times you can see the fibers in them, you can see light through them, but they are very strong. So if you look up at the top there, you can see the Abelmoschus manihope root, the sunset muskmallow. They've taken it, they call Tororo Aoi, and in Japan. And so basically what they've done is they've taken the roots, they've crushed them, and then they've left them to soak in water for somewhere between a few hours and a few days. And what happens is all that mucilage starts to like, disperse into the water. Once it gets nice and gooey, like you're seeing in this picture, then it will be strained through a sieve, and then additionally through a piece of like fine fabric. And what's left remaining is none of the pieces of the root or anything like that, but just this really gooey substance. And it's essential to the art of washi paper making because you essentially have a water bath that's full of all these fibers from the paper mulberry tree. And if they were just in there without anything sort of suspending them evenly in the mix, they would just settle down to the bottom. It would be very hard to be able to evenly distribute them onto the paper. So this acts as a suspension agent. It keeps everything nicely mixed up in the vat, so that when somebody pulls a screen through and pulls up all the fibers, they disperse nicely and evenly into a good mat on the screen. They also have a slight bonding capability. It's not sticky. It would be incorrect to call it sticky. It's not glue-like. But what it does is it bonds to each of the different fibers and helps bond water to those fibers. And then as the paper dries out, those water molecules start to evaporate and the fibers start to look for something else to bond to. And so they bond to each other. And so it makes the paper extremely strong. You can see examples of fine craft papers down here that can be used for a lot of different applications, like paper screens. Some people will use it for origami or for fine, like wedding invitations or calligraphic art, or even clothing textiles. So it's a interesting relationship there, in a way that you can take something that potentially looks pretty gross and slimy and turn it into something just stunningly beautiful. I want to make a little side mention here of another plant that is kind of interesting in the mucilaginous root category, and that's Althea officinalis. We know them as marshmallows, and I know that for a lot of people, when I say marshmallow, you're thinking of the little, the jet puff things that you find in the grocery store. Today, that's pretty much a mix of corn syrup and gelatin. It doesn't have much relationship to this plant, but this plant actually is the source of the original marshmallow. It has the same types of roots that our previous plant, Apomostis manihote, had. They're very mucilaginous. And so people would take that slime from beating the roots, and they'd mix it with other substances to make medicinal or tasty treats. The ancient Egyptians used to mix it with honey and maybe put in some nuts there, and it was like an extremely highly valued treat. It was reserved basically for royalty and for offerings to the gods. And then a little bit later, the French came along and they said, well, we can do this a little bit differently. They took the Althea root and they whipped it up with some eggs and sugar and made little bars, which are called pâté de guimauve. And these bars were considered somewhat medicinal, not just tasty, but medicinal. And the reason for that is this mucilage is really soothing. So if you have, a sore throat, or your stomach is upset, or you have like inflammation in any sort of like surface tissues in your body, the mucilage helps to sort of create like a protective barrier and to lubricate things. So they were prescribed for some of those types of like maladies or not feeling well, even though they were also enjoyed as a very tasty treat. So it's just something, it's an interesting tie back to see like a plant that, the name has been retained by the tree, but we've lost a little bit of the original process, but that was very much based on using these mucilaginous properties. So here you go. You can see this is the Althea root. You can see some marshmallows that were made using traditional techniques versus kind of what you see in a bag in the store today. They're much, I think they're really pretty. You can totally make them at home if you can come up with some of these. These are not hard plants to find. And I'm sure you could order roots if you wanted to. So good chance to get back to the roots of things. All right. So I have one more story to share with you, and it's kind of like a multi-part story. So these are plants, not roots, but they interact very much so with roots. They're parasitic plants. Parasites, if you think about the relationship with the word parasite, we tend to sort of think it's creepy, it's living off of something else. It's not necessarily creepy and it's not necessarily harmful, but basically what it means is that, nature, we have symbiosis, right? That's like, I give you something, you give me something, everybody's pretty happy. Parasitism just basically means that it's a one-way street, like you're always giving and you're never really getting anything in return. It doesn't necessarily mean that you don't have enough to give. It may only be taking a little bit. It may not hurt you to give that amount. But it does mean you're not really getting anything in return. So these species are basically they have that kind of relationship with their host plants. This right here on the left is a ghost pipe. It's one that if you do happen to live here in the DC area or along in the eastern United States, you might have a chance to see if you're in the forest floor. We'll talk a little bit about them in a bit. But first, I'd like to talk about Rafflesia. It's sometimes called the stinking corpse lily, which is a very evocative name. It is an enormous flower. You can see here, this is a few Rafflesia flowers on the forest floor in the Philippines. And they're an interesting plant because they don't have leaves, they don't have a stem. They're basically just a flower. And all of their development happens inside the root of its host plant. The host plant for these are tetrastigmas called liana. It's a wild relative of in the grape family. And so these vines are growing throughout their host environments. And the Rafflesia infects the vine on the inside, and they spend most of their life as just a tiny little cluster of cells inside this vine. And then when it becomes time to flower, they go from this tiny little cluster of cells to being literally the biggest single bloom in the world. These things can be 20 to 25 pounds. They can be 3 to 4 feet across. So this is an enormous flower. But they don't have the ability to make nutrients at all. They have lost the ability to photosynthesize. They actually don't even carry that DNA anymore. And so they need to get any nutrients that they get from this host vine, the tetrastigma. You can see here on this next slide, those are some tetrastigma leaves that we have here in the garden. There are a bunch of different species of tetrastigma, and there are also a bunch of different species of Rafflesia. How these plants spread. We know that they set seed. They flower, they set seed. They are pollinated by flies, which is sort of, if you think about their common name, the stinking corpse lily, a lot of these plants that smell like rotting meat, they're designed to attract flies as pollinators. So they are pollinated and they do set seeds. What happens after that to help it travel around the environment and then actually infect a new host plant is not fully understood. And that's something that is sort of a theme in parasitic plants. We know it happens, but because so much of this stuff happens, they've been I'll just say they've been generally poorly understood over time. So it's something that we've been looking at a little bit here in the garden as to how to help understand how that happens and whether Rafflesia plant could actually bloom from seed outside of its natural environment. All right. So moving from relative jungle to the desert. There is another root parasite out here that is very interesting. It's called Felisma sonore. Common name for it is sand food because it was used as a food source for Native Americans and was considered, I can't comment to the taste. It was considered to be an important foodstuff in times of famine. This, if you look at this, it kind of looks like a big, massive golf ball with some flowers on the top. This is what you see on the surface. So the flowers are, as you would expect, a flower. They do set seed. They are, they're going to go through the whole life cycle of flowering. But what's happening around them, that big golf ball, is actually the top of the stem. And I'm going to show you on the next slide here. You can see an herbarium specimen of this plant. So what we were just looking at is the very top of that big fan-shaped structure. And then if you see, there's a super long root and stem apparatus happening underneath it. You may have noticed, oh, this is another plant that is not green. So again, they've lost the ability to photosynthesize. They need to have host plants in order to survive, to get their nutrients. They do get their own water. If you look at that long section of stem there. It kind of has a bunch of little scales on it. If you look at the surface of the pad, it also has a sort of like a scaly texture that's designed to help like channel water toward it. And then that's where the majority of the water absorption happens. But they need to get their nutrients from somewhere. So if you look over on the right side here, these are pictures from a USBG scouting trip out to the deserts of the American Southwest, which is where this plant is found. These are two of the host plants for sand food, or for Philisma. And you can see they're very different from each other. One is sort of a big scrubby bush. This is Aringonium, is actually the buckwheat family. But this is a desert species. You can see there's kind of like a big stem coming over from the side. That's because these guys have evolved to live in sand dunes, and sand dunes, they shift, they move. And so the stem, like a lot of times they're called walking because they will sort of move from one place to the other. The stem's anchoring them, but they move around as the sands shift. It's very similar to actually probably why the sand food has the shape that it does, because the sands will go, the profile of the soil will go up or down. Sometimes they'll be almost completely buried. Sometimes they might stick a little bit out of the ground. Another host plant you can see is Tequila plicata. That's another very small shrub. You can see here that the shrub itself is not very big, but the Philisma is almost as big as the shrub. But as we were talking about with parasites before, they don't always harm the plant. They're able to live side by side and coexist. It's not harming the plant in order for the Philisma to be there. They go down to the root structure of the plant, and then they latch on and they grow out of there. So another interesting parasitic plant that's parasitizing roots of neighboring plants. I have one more parasite I'd like to show to you, and this one is a little bit different. It's called Monotropa uniflora. It's also called the ghost pipe, which I just mentioned a little bit earlier. Monotropa uniflora, if you break it down into Latin, basically means monotropa is one turn and uniflora is one flower. So you can kind of look at the picture on the right and see how this is like a cluster of single flowers here. And they do get their nutrients from other plants, but they do it in an interesting way because they tend to grow, they're most associated with beech forests, but they can grow in a bunch of forest trees, could be their hosts, but they don't latch on straight to the tree. What they do is they utilize that mycorrhizal network that I was talking about before. So they're actually parasites of the fungi. So normally I talked about there's that interplay where the mycorrhizae, they bring nutrients to the plant, and in exchange the plant gives them sugars. These guys are like, I don't need to give you sugars back. It's okay. You're just going to bring me what I need, and I'm just going to do my thing. Again, it's a plant that's not green. So it's a common theme in these parasites. They don't need to photosynthesize. They're getting all of their nutrients from their host. So they don't need to be green. They're very pretty though. You can see here a couple of the species of mushrooms that are hosts. So they're not very super picky about which particular species they form relationships with, but they are all within the Russulaceae family. You can see up at the top here, this is a Russola mushroom species. It's a pretty big genus of mushrooms. It has about 750 species around the world. They're fairly well distributed. And below it, you can see a Lactarius species. So this is also in the same family. They're sometimes called the milky caps, and you can sort of get a little hint of that with the Lactarius in the name, like the lacto. It means that when you disturb or break or damage these mushrooms in any way, they ooze white milky sap. So these guys are fairly commonly found throughout forests, the Lactarius in particular in the northern hemisphere. And they form what is called an ectomycorrhizal relationship. with plants in general, not just these, but with any. And if you look over on the left side here, you can see basically what it's doing is it's creating a big blanket around the root hair, the root of a host plant. And instead of piercing all those cell walls, you can see that there's kind of like a little lattice of these orange cells growing in between the spaces of all the other cells. And so they grab on and they sort of like grow in between the cracks. And that allows them to sort of envelop the root, and it facilitates a lot more like surface area for it to transfer nutrients. They can be pretty big, these fungal sheaths. They protect the roots, but they also can like stretch out a little bit into the soil, and it gives them broader range to be pulling nutrients in. So these guys have relationships with those trees that I was telling you about, like particularly the beeches and the oaks, and they are pulling nutrients in and giving them to the ghost pipes, which are very ephemeral. You know, you might get a good rain, then you get some ghost pipes. They tend to bloom in the summer. They do bloom. They're like any other flower. They set seed, they're wind dispersed, and then they're able to spread inside of an environment that has like all the necessary hosts for them. So these are just a few of the interesting plant relationships that are happening under the ground.